Here you will find one of the most unsettling cases in Missouri Ozark history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. It was mentioned as an essential refurbishment in the old county records. In its October 1904 issue, the West Plains Gazette stated that the Howell County Jail would be temporarily closed for structural modifications. It was a straightforward, unremarkable notification. The three-story limestone building, which had been there since 1883, was beginning to exhibit the effects of aging. According to County Commissioner Thomas Wilford's official assessment, the foundation had been compromised by moisture. For more than 50 years, the events that transpired would be buried in jumbled documents and whispered discussions, making it one of the darkest periods in Ozark history. The jail was partially hidden by an oak tree grove on the outskirts of West Plains, Missouri. It appeared to be a modest building because just the upper story was visible from the main road. Originally hailed for keeping inmates calm during the summer heat, the facility actually stretched far into the hillside and had 2 underground floors that stayed cool all year round. The majority of the 23 prisoners confined there by 1904 were serving brief sentences for unpaid bills, public intoxication, and minor larceny. The jail's architecture was a reflection of late 19th century institutional design theories. The sheriff's quarters, administrative offices, and cells for low-risk or awaiting trial offenders were located on the upper floor. The general populace was confined in a semicircle of iron-barred cells on the middle floor, surrounded by a central guard station. This austere adaptation of the panopticon design allowed for maximum surveillance with the least amount of staff. The lowest level, which was rarely noted in official records, housed storage spaces, a network of small passageways excavated straight into the bedrock underneath the building, and isolation cells for troublesome inmates. In a survey conducted in 1887, local geologist Samuel Burnham pointed out that the jail had been constructed on top of a labyrinth of naturally occurring limestone caverns. These pre-existing formations had been integrated into the foundation by the builders, who created the lowest level by enlarging some passageways and shutting others. Inmates and personnel claimed chronic respiratory complaints as a result of this peculiar foundation, which also caused ongoing humidity problems and occasionally enabled groundwater to flow into the lower cells during periods of heavy rain. Sheriff Nathaniel Dawson kept careful records of everything that happened in the jail every day. His neat and efficient handwriting filled leather-bound ledgers with the names, sentencing, and behavioral comments of the inmates. Dawson's entry from the 28th of September 1904 stated that Mason James Harlow will be performing a structural examination. The ledger did not include a list of transported convicts, transportation records, or receiving signatures from Springfield authorities, and the entry for the next day was noticeably short. All prisoners transferred to Springfield for temporary holding during repairs. Before this entry, every prisoner movement had been meticulously recorded in Dawson's records, including the time of departure, the mode of transportation, the escort staff, and confirmation of arrival at the target facility. The reconstruction was surrounded by a number of administrative abnormalities, the first of which was this abrupt departure from established protocol. According to the county treasurer's files, neither money was set aside for the transportation of prisoners to Springfield, nor for their short-term accommodation at another institution. According to the stableman's records, the county's jail wagon was still in its shed on the days that the transfer was purported to have taken place. During that week, there were no prisoner transportation mentioned in the manifest of the railroad station. It seemed as though 23 men had just disappeared. In 1958, Margaret Evers, a local historian who was studying the county's architectural history, found this disparity. A study of limestone construction methods turned into something far more unsettling. Evers pointed out that there was no documentation of transfers from Howell County to the Springfield Detention Center in September or October of 1904. Furthermore, according to the Springfield jail's own ledgers, they were running at full capacity at the time because of a surge in railroad employees who had been jailed during labor disputes. Then, where were the 23 prisoners from Howell County? Retired schoolteacher Evers, known for his meticulous investigation, started looking through county documents to find the missing inmates. her rising unease as pattern after pattern appeared, none of which pointed to legal prisoner transfers, is documented in her notebooks, which are kept in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society. The names of all West Plains residents, including those who were incarcerated, were reported in the 1900 census. When these names were compared to later records, an oddity emerged. None of the people named as jail detainees in September 1904 were mentioned in any subsequent records, including marriage licenses, death certificates, or real estate transactions. 23 people seem to have just disappeared off the face of the earth. Given the growing bureaucratization of the time, this omission was especially noticeable. At all governmental levels, record-keeping was increased in the early 1900s. Census data, tax records, military registrations, property deeds, marriage certificates, death records, or media mentions are usually examples of the documentary evidence left by a person who lived at that time. The simultaneous disappearance of 23 males from all official documents raised the possibility of intentional erasure as opposed to administrative error. The 84-year-old Ella Lanner Puigt, who had been employed as a cook in the jail from 1901 to 1905, was the subject of Evers' research. The first sight of what actually transpired during those renovations came from Puigt's testimony, which was captured on a crackling reel-to-reel tape that is currently kept in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society. "They brought in workers I'd never seen before," Puigt said on the tape, "not local men. They came from St. Louis, is what I heard. They worked at night, mostly. Sheriff Dawson told me not to come in for about 2 weeks. Said they were doing something with the walls that would stir up dust, make the kitchen unusable." Her voice decreased to almost a whisper. "When I came back, the place smelled different, like lime, and something else, something that made my throat close up." Following the renovations, Puigt's story continued with observations of behavioral changes among the jail staff. The guards wouldn't look each other in the eye anymore. They'd been a rowdy bunch before, always joking and carrying on. After the work was done, they barely spoke. Deputy Collins took to drinking heavy, him who'd never touched spirits before. Said he couldn't sleep without it. Sheriff Dawson would lock himself in his office for hours. I'd bring him his meals, and half the time, he wouldn't even touch them. Just sat there, staring at the wall. Changes in the local political landscape occurred at the same time as the renovation. Shortly thereafter, Thomas Wilford, who had approved the jail reconstruction, was promoted to a state position, a significant step up for a county commissioner from a little Ozark hamlet. Although neighbors said Sheriff Dawson seemed healthy when he departed West Plains for Arkansas, he resigned in December 1904, citing health issues. 6 months after the jail reopened, all of the officials involved had left the region. The body of Deputy Collins, who was referenced in Puigt's testimony, was found in the Current River in January 1905. Because of the deceased's high blood alcohol content, the coroner determined that the death was an accidental drowning. But the investigating officer's report, which was kept in the county archives but never formally filed, asked why Collins had been at the river miles from his house in the dead of winter and without a horse or car in sight. In a similar vein, 3 additional guards who had been employed at the jail throughout the reconstruction phase also left West Plains under peculiar circumstances. According to reports, one moved to California without telling his family where he was going. Another, who had no prior expertise in the industry, joined a logging operation in Washington state. The third just disappeared, leaving behind an unclaimed pay at the county office and a fully furnished home. Subtle but important changes were made to the structure itself. The inner walls seemed thicker after the remodeling, reducing the cell measurements by around 18 inches on each side, according to a comparison of pre- and post-renovation photos. In 1962, architectural evaluations revealed that the limestone utilized for renovation had a different texture and color from the original building material. These new walls lacked the empty gaps that were common in the masonry work of the time, making them unusually solid. The biggest alterations were made to the lower levels, when new walls were built and entire passages were blocked off. On the lowest level, there were 17 cells and a network of connected passageways, according to the original floor design that was saved in 1883 county documents. Only 9 cells and a streamlined corridor system were shown in the 1905 revision to the concept. Unusual considering the overcrowding problems that had apparently prompted the remodeling in the first place, the documentation provided no justification for this capacity reduction. Payment to Harlow Stone and Masonry for the delivery of 1,200 layers of quicklime, 80 bags of Portland cement, and specialty sealing chemicals in October 1904 was noted by a clerk in the county expenditure records. The amount was significantly more than what would be needed for a structure of that size to undergo normal upgrades. The purchase order also included odd things that aren't usually related to masonry construction, such 6 cases of chloroform, 18 leather restraints, and 25 pounds of laudanum. Both Wilford's signature and the category of miscellaneous construction supplies were applied to these products. The need for sedatives and restraints during a building project was not explained. The expenses of the jail renovations were not mentioned in the October or November issues of the West Plains Gazette, which usually covers county spending in great detail. The paper's thorough coverage of other public works initiatives, such as the repair of the courthouse clock tower that year, for which every dollar was tracked down in print, contrasts sharply with this omission. Margaret Evers found that the pertinent pages of the county ledger had been taken out when she tried to find the financial documents for the jail remodeling. If not for the interruption in page numbering, the cut would have gone unnoticed because it was so clean. William Schrader, the editor of the newspaper at the time, was a well-known West Plains Business Association member and Thomas Wilford's brother-in-law, although no specifics of the Community Improvement Initiative were documented. The association's September 1904 minutes mention that all members present pledged their assistance and their silence on the matter, until such time as Commissioner Wilford deems appropriate to make public the nature of the improvements. The initiative required absolute discretion and unanimous support. A number of strange occurrences were reported in the vicinity of the jail in the weeks after the renovations. At the nearby mill, a night watchman reported hearing a terrible wailing that he ascribed to mountain lions. 2 times, a local doctor was called to the jail to treat guards who were experiencing strange episodes of fainting. The abrupt departure of 2 stonemasons who had been involved in the remodeling was the most significant. They left their personal belongings in their rented room and fled without collecting their final pay, according to boarding house documents. In his own diary, the town butcher, whose shop was across from the jail, wrote that the smell from the renovation was unlike any I have encountered in my profession. It clings to clothing and hair, persisting even after washing. Several customers have commented on it, though Sheriff Dawson insists it is merely lime and fresh mortar. I find myself closing my windows despite the autumn heat. Horatio Clane, the butcher, continued to record oddities in the months after the renovation. According to his notebook, which was found in 1963 among family documents, the jail's new walls appeared to weep when the humidity level was high. When he wrote in November 1904, "A strange effluvium seeps through the mortar." Sheriff Dawson has had the exterior whitewashed 3 times since the renovation, yet the discoloration returns within days. It begins as small, rust-colored spots that gradually expand and darken. The Methodist ladies have complained about the odor when walking past the building to Sunday services. Reverend Simmons suggested a special blessing for the structure, but Dawson refused to allow it. Dawson is gone now. His replacement seems unaware of what transpired here. The walls have stopped their weeping with the winter cold. Perhaps spring will resurrect more than just the flowers. I have decided to sell my shop. I cannot bear to look across the street any longer. Some knowledge cannot be lived with. This was Klein's final entry about the jail, written in February 1905. The diary ends abruptly after this entry. According to county records, Klein moved to Nebraska after selling his butcher shop in March 1905. Melancholia leading to self-starvation. A frequent diagnosis for what is today known as severe depression is listed as the cause of death on his 1,917 death certificate. Core samples were collected from a number of buildings, including the then-abandoned jail, in 1961 by Dr. William Thornton, a geologist working on a survey of historic sites in the Ozarks. His research revealed anomalies in the composition of the jail's walls and was published in a small academic journal. In between mortar and limestone layers, he found what he called organic particulate matter embedded in the concrete. The samples were transferred to a St. Louis laboratory, but the findings were never made public. Soon after, Dr. Thornton acquired a teaching position in California and ended his research, leaving his Ozark survey unfinished. Thornton's discoveries raised concerns, as evidenced by entries in a journal discovered among his belongings following his death in 1968, November 1961. The material appears to be osseous in nature, he wrote. I've requested further analysis, but have been informed the samples were compromised during transit. I find this explanation unsatisfactory, given the preservation methods employed. Something about this situation feels deliberately obstructed. The paper continues. Called Dr. Mimer at the lab today. He was uncharacteristically reticent, claiming he could not discuss the samples over the telephone. When pressed, he stated only that some matters are better left to rest and suggested I focus on other aspects of my survey. This is the same man who once exhumed a colonial cemetery to study soil composition changes. His sudden concern for propriety is suspect at best. According to Thornton's later notes, his research was increasingly hampered by equipment failures that caused delays, unexpectedly empty local lodgings, and the revocation of research permissions without warning. His research had been fully approved and allocated just months prior, but authorities abruptly withdrew his financing from the institution, alleging budgetary difficulties. In a December 1961 letter, he stated, I cannot escape the feeling that I'm being deliberately impeded. Yesterday, I returned to my motel room to find my sample case open and several core sections missing, specifically those taken from the lower level of the jail. The local sheriff was unsympathetic when I reported the theft, suggesting I had been careless with my materials. When I mentioned the specific nature of what was stolen, his demeanor changed noticeably. He asked pointed questions about what I hoped to find in the jail walls and who had commissioned my research. Thornton's last note about the jail states, a visitor at my motel today didn't provide a name, but showed credentials identifying him as being with the State Historical Commission. Asked detailed questions about my sampling methodology, locations, and who I might have discussed my findings with. His interest seemed less academic than cautionary. Mentioned that historical research can sometimes open doors best left closed, particularly in small communities with long memories. I've decided to conclude my work here earlier than planned. Thornton's widow later disclosed that in the years after his departure from Missouri, he refused to discuss his Ozark research, even with colleagues. Despite the possible career benefits, he declined multiple chances to return to the area for follow-up initiatives. Witnesses said that when the subject of West Plains came up at a geology conference in 1965, Thornton abruptly left the conversation and seemed clearly upset for the rest of the gathering. When a new county facility was built nearer the courthouse in 1927, the jail continued to operate. The old building was used for a number of purposes during the next 20 years, including storage, temporary refuge during floods, and a brief cannery during wartime rations. Employees frequently complained about the building's stifling environment. Despite numerous sealant applications, maintenance workers saw odd moisture patterns in some wall areas, with moisture leaking through. According to county archives, following preliminary evaluations, a number of plans to convert the structure for more significant uses were shelved, including plans for a National Guard armory in 1941 and a community center in 1932. The reasons given included things like improper interior design and ongoing moisture problems. But one engineering study was more direct when it mentioned an inexplicable resistance among workers to remain in the building after dusk. Walter Simmons, the facility's custodian from 1930 to 1939, kept a journal of maintenance problems and odd events. The document, which is kept in the county archives, lists ongoing issues with the building's infrastructure, including pipes that kept bursting even after being replaced with new materials, electrical systems that malfunctioned in completely clear weather, and mysterious temperature swings in certain rooms, especially those on the lower floors. Simmons also observed trends in the behavior of people entering the facility. He wrote, "Visitors to the upper floors report nothing unusual. In 1937, those who ventured to the lowest level rarely returned for a second visit. Workers assigned to repair the boiler room have on 4 separate occasions left the job incomplete, forfeiting their payment rather than return to complete the work. When questioned, they provide vague explanations about bad air or uncomfortable feelings. One man, more forthcoming than the others, described a sensation of being watched by something hostile while working in the Northeast Corridor." In a 1955 statement to the West Plains Historical Society, former night watchman Edwin Hull recounted his memories working there from 1928 to 1931. Hull remarked, "Those walls weren't right. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like tapping coming from inside them, faint, like someone using the last of their strength. The first few times I searched every room, thinking an animal had gotten trapped in there somehow. Never found anything. After a while, I just learned not to make my rounds through the old cell blocks after midnight." Holt continued, "There was this one wall in the northeast corner of the lowest level. Nobody would go near it. Even the homeless who'd break in during winter wouldn't sleep against that wall. One night during a heavy rain, I saw something seeping through the mortar there. Wasn't water. Darker. Had a smell that made me think of the slaughterhouse outside town. Reported it to my supervisor, but by morning it had dried up. They sent a mason to check anyway. Fellow took one look at the wall, then walked out. Wouldn't come back even when they offered him extra pay." 3 more people who worked in the building during its post-jail years have statements in the Historical Society files. They all spoke of the same phenomenon: odd noises that seemed to come from inside solid masonry, parts of the wall that stayed cool to the touch even during summer heat waves, and what one maintenance worker called the feeling of being watched by something trapped and angry. During the cannery's brief existence in 1943, Dorothy Welch, a clerk, described an event involving a new employee who had been placed at the lowest level. The young man, I believe his name was Timothy, was organizing crates in the old isolation cell area. He came running upstairs in a state of extreme agitation, claiming he had heard voices coming from inside the walls. Several workers, including myself, accompanied him back downstairs, but heard nothing unusual. The following day, Timothy failed to report for work. When the foreman telephoned his boarding house, he was informed that Timothy had packed his belongings and departed on the early morning bus, leaving no forwarding address. Welch noted that this was not a singular occurrence. 7 workers quit after being transferred to the lower level during the 6 months that the cannery was in operation. None gave prior warning. They just didn't come back after certain shifts. The manager's final report, written after the operation was shut down in December 1943, recommended that the building be demolished due to persistent worker retention issues and unexplained equipment failures. The report mentioned atmospheric conditions unconducive to food processing operations, without specifically mentioning the employee accounts, something that briefly surfaced in local publications in 1949. When the northeast corner partially collapsed, was strangely dropped. Workers removing the wreckage found what looked to be human remains embedded in the wall material, according to the first account published in the West Plains Daily Quill. Instead, an irrelevant item about agricultural pricing took the place of the follow-up story that was supposed to appear the next day. When researcher Margaret Evers tried to obtain coroner's conclusions or police reports about the discovery, she was told there were none. A single image of what looks to be a human femur, partially covered in concrete, was discovered in reporter Samuel Kent's personal collection following his death in 1960. Kent's handwriting merely reads, "Howell evidence" on the picture. In the weeks leading up to his unexpected and deadly heart attack, Kent's wife stated that her husband had been working on what he called the story that would define the century. If he had any notes on this project, they were never found. One evening, Mrs. Kent remembered, her husband came home clearly shaken. Sam had interviewed an old man who claimed to have worked on the jail renovation as a young apprentice. He wouldn't tell me exactly what the man had said, only that it confirmed his suspicions about what happened there that night. He locked all his notes in his desk drawer, something he'd never done before. The next morning we found the drawer forced open, and the contents disturbed, though Sam insisted nothing was missing. 3 days later, he passed away. Even though Kent was 47 years old and had no past history of cardiac issues, the coroner's report described his death as myocardial infarction, which was in line with his age and physical condition. Only 2 weeks prior, his doctor had examined him and declared him well. Photographer Martin Delaney, who worked with Kent at the Daily Quill, later disclosed that he had gone with Kent to take pictures of the remains that were found. Delaney said, "There was more than just that single bone," in a 1967 interview that was taped. Delaney stated that within hours of the discovery, county officials had cordoned off the area and brought in a construction crew that worked through the night to remove the collapsed section entirely. When the wall collapsed, it revealed what looked like a cavity, a space about the size of a man, with organic material embedded in the surrounding concrete. The county sheriff arrived before we could take more than a few photos, confiscating Sam's film roll. But missing the one he'd already removed from the camera and pocketed, which is the image you've seen, it doesn't show the position of the remains' arms extended upward, as if the person had been trying to claw their way out. By daylight, the workers had scattered, the debris removed, and the wall had been reconstructed. Kent tried to interview the construction workers, but was told they had already left the region after being hired from Springfield. In 1951, the county commission ordered the jail's demolition, claiming structural instability as a reason for public safety concerns. Unusually thorough was the demolition process. Workers were told to excavate 8 feet below ground level and dispose of the materials at various locations throughout the county in order to eliminate all traces of the structure, instead of leaving the foundation intact, as was customary. After that, 3 feet of new topsoil was spread over the property, and oak seedlings were planted. With no plaque or marker to record what formerly stood there, the location is now just an ordinary grove of trees. Despite having spent his whole life in West Plains, Raymond Stokes, the demolition crew's foreman, left the area as soon as the project was finished. Stokes reportedly moved to Nebraska and never came back to Missouri, not even for family funerals, and he refused to talk about the job, saying only that some things should stay buried. But that place wouldn't rest easy, even under concrete. His sister, interviewed in 1964, recalled a cryptic statement made prior to his departure. "Ray told me they found things in those walls that no Christian should have to look at," said the county officials made the crew sign some kind of confidentiality agreement, unusual for a simple demolition job. "Whatever they uncovered in that building changed my brother. He was always a cheerful man before that job. Afterward, he couldn't seem to shake a persistent melancholy. His letters from Nebraska rarely mention his life in West Plains, as if he's trying to erase those memories." A pipe burst in their storage facility in 1952, causing what was called a unfortunate accident that lost the records of Harlow Stone and Masonry, the company that had done the refurbishment in 1904 and the demolition in 1951. Soon after, the company disbanded, and its founders moved to other states or retired. However, the business manager of the company had kept duplicate ledgers at home, which was standard procedure for small enterprises around that time. In 1966, his daughter found these records, which included entries pertaining to both projects. Unusual expenses were noted in the 1904 renovation ledger, including much higher pay for night work, bonuses for employees who accepted special confidentiality clauses, payments to a local physician for discretionary medical services, and a sizable amount sent straight to Sheriff Dawson as a administrative facilitation fee. Equally instructive were the demolition records from 1951. The materials that were taken out of the site were classified as either standard or special handling required. The latter group made up around 30% of the overall volume and was dispersed across the live county. A sinkhole on a county commissioner's own property, an abandoned mine shaft, and a recently excavated portion of the municipal landfill were among the precise dumping locations mentioned in the ledger. Concrete caps were then placed over each of these sites, an uncommon safety measure for common construction waste. After his aunt passed away in 1962, Elena Puig's nephew found a sealed mason jar buried in her yard. A folded page taken from her personal diary, dated the 17th of October 1904, was found within. The faintly legible handwriting read, "They're sealing them in. God forgive us all. They're putting them right into the walls. I heard the screaming last night, Mr. Harlow said they'd run out of sedative. Sheriff said it doesn't matter. The new concrete will set quickly enough. 23 souls. I count them in my prayers, though I fear the Almighty has turned his face from this place. Mr. Wilford says it's for the greater good, that these men are the diseased tissue that must be cut away. I've given my notice, but I'm told I must stay through month's end. May God have mercy on my cowardice. The diary page continued on the reverse side. October 18th. I cannot sleep. The sounds from below are fewer now. Mr. Harlow says 10 walls are completed. 13 more to go. I saw them take Miller down yesterday. He was conscious enough to understand what was happening. The look in his eyes will haunt me until my dying day. They told his family he was transferred to Jefferson City. A letter with his signature arrived for his wife today. Sheriff had him sign it last week. How many other false letters will be delivered? How many families will spend years waiting for men who will never return? The final entry read, October 19th. The Methodist minister came today, asking after Cooper, who served as their groundskeeper before his arrest for drunkenness. Sheriff told him Cooper had been transferred due to his respiratory condition. The minister seemed satisfied with this explanation, though Cooper's lungs were strong as an ox. I nearly spoke out then, but fear closed my throat. What kind of woman have I become to witness such things and remain silent? I will leave this place, but will God allow me to leave these memories behind? Some stains cannot be washed away. Joseph Pewitt, the nephew, brought this evidence to the County Historical Society, but it was dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman known to be susceptible to fantastical thinking, when he continued, trying to have the handwriting examined by a Springfield expert. He was reportedly visited by a number of prominent citizens who suggested that dredging up old controversies could affect his standing in the community and his employment at the lumber mill. Shortly after that, the diary page vanished from his home. Joseph Pewitt himself grew more and more withdrawn, confiding in neighbors that he thought they were watching him. He sold his land and relocated to Oregon in 1966. He told a longtime buddy before he left that he had copied his aunt's journal entry and given it to people outside of Howell County. According to reports, he stated, "If anything happens to me, those papers will find their way to people who can't be silenced, since no such documents have ever been made public." Scholars have theorized that Pewitt's safety precautions may have been successful, even if they meant hiding the evidence. County Commissioner Wilford's personal correspondence, donated to the Missouri Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1959, contained oblique references to what he termed the permanent solution to our overcrowding situation. In a letter to State Senator Jameson dated August 1904, Wilford wrote, "The financial burden of maintaining these dregs of society has become untenable. Each costs the taxpayer nearly $200 annually, money that could rebuild our schools or improve our roads. We've developed an approach that will eliminate this burden entirely, while simultaneously strengthening the very institution designed to contain them." Ironic justice, one might say. Another letter addressed to Sheriff Dawson just days before the renovation began provided more explicit instructions. The prisoners should be prepared, as we discussed. Laudanum, in increasing doses over 3 days, should ensure minimal resistance when the time comes. Those with violent tendencies should receive additional sedation. Under no circumstances should any of them be permitted to communicate with outside parties during this period. As agreed, you will personally oversee the first phase to ensure Mason Harlow understands our requirements precisely. Wilford's correspondence from November 1904 after the renovation's completion included a disturbing assessment of the project's success. Our solution has proven even more economical than anticipated. The structure is indeed stronger, the problem cases permanently resolved, and the ongoing expenses eliminated entirely. There were, I grant you, some unanticipated difficulties in the execution, primarily related to the final specimens who had developed tolerance to the sedative. Harlow assures me that any sounds which might have been detected during the process would have been attributed to the normal noises of construction. By spring, even the most sensitive nose will detect nothing unusual in passing the building. His final reference to the matter came in a letter dated December 1905, by which time he had assumed his state position in Jefferson City. The West Plains matter remained securely handled. Dawson's departure was regrettable but necessary given his increasing instability. His replacement appears suitably incurious about the previous administration's activities. I've ensured that all financial records have been appropriately adjusted and the relevant documentation secured in my private files. Time will complete our work, burying memory just as we buried the problem itself. According to an examination of court documents from 1903-1904, Judge Henry Crawford had given disproportionately severe punishments for minor infractions in the months before the Reconstruction. Normally 30-day sentences were reduced to 6 months or a year for men. There were mysterious allusions to this time period in Judge Crawford's personal journal, which was found among his belongings after his death in 1931. The severity serves a greater purpose, he wrote in July 1904. Newspaper accounts characterized the increased jail population as unhygienic and potentially dangerous conditions. Crawford was appointed to the State Appeals Court in 1905, an uncommon promotion for a rural county judge without political ties. Wilford's solution, while extreme, will resolve several problems simultaneously. I find myself reluctant, yet convinced of its necessity. The community must be protected from these elements and our resources directed toward worthier purposes. Crawford's private notes about particular cases were more illuminating. He had placed little notes next to the names of some defendants that matched well-known families in the West Plains. The name Whitford was written next to Jacob Miller's entry after he was given an 8-month term for horse theft. Samuel Whitford was the town's biggest landowner. The newspaper editor's family name, Schroeder, was applied to Thomas Cooper, who was sentenced to 6 months in prison for public intoxication. A trend became apparent when comparing these records to others. Every man who vanished during the renovations had some sort of relationship to the town's wealthy families. Some had observed irregularities, while others had dated the daughters of well-known people. A number of them had threatened to reveal government wrongdoing or corporate malfeasance. In a sense, they symbolized loose threads in the intricately woven fabric of West Plain culture, which the Restoration had irrevocably cut. Reports from medical examiners in 1904 also reveal an odd trend. County physician Dr. Frederick Winters certified 7 inmate fatalities from January to September, all of which were ascribed to tuberculosis complications, even though there had been no prior indication of an outbreak. There are no graves with these names in nearby cemeteries, and although these deaths were listed in the county registry, no burial sites were mentioned, despite requirements requiring notice of such outbreaks. Dr. Winters did not disclose tuberculosis infections in the penitentiary in his official correspondence with state health officials. Purchases of many pounds of laudanum, an opium tincture used as a sedative, and large amounts of quicklime, which is usually used as a disinfectant in mass graves, are documented in his medical ledger, which is kept in the county records. The amounts were substantially more than he would require for his usual practice. Early in 1905, Dr. Winters moved to Colorado to start a practice after leaving West Plains. His abrupt departure left accounts unresolved and patient records in a state of chaos. In a letter to the medical organization, a colleague who took over his practice wrote that Winters had been profoundly disturbed during his last weeks in town, self-medicating with alcohol and speaking of unforgivable sins committed in service to the community. The most damning evidence was discovered in 1964 when a leather satchel that contained what seemed to be Sheriff Dawson's unofficial documents was discovered by construction workers digging for a water main close to the former jail site. The wet but partially readable documents described payments made by the county's wealthy families, businessmen, politicians, and landowners for what Dawson called permanent inmate removal. These payments were made in tandem with the disappearance of people who had embarrassment or financial damage to these families. The 23 men who disappeared during the renovations were people whose offenses included organizing labor among the mining communities, threatening to expose commercial fraud, and fathering children with daughters of powerful families. In essence, they were inconvenient men whose continuous presence jeopardized Howell County's established order. Additionally, a rudimentary design of the jail's floor plan, with annotations showing the locations of particular convicts within the walls, was included in the satchel. One of Dawson's handwritten notes stated that troublemakers should be positioned near ventilation channels to ensure expedited completion of process. One of the collection's most unsettling documents was a list of prisoners with comments about whether or not they should be included. Each entry contained an anticipated completion time that ranged from 4 to 6 hours to possibly 2 to 3 days, depending on wall thickness and air availability. Physical qualities were noted, such as strong constitution, will require additional preparation, or physically weakened by recent illness, ideal candidate. The foreman received the satchel from the workers who found it and called the county sheriff. Witnesses claimed that the sheriff personally showed up to pick up the materials while promising the men that the discovery would be thoroughly examined. One of the employees had looked over the documents prior to the sheriff's arrival, but no formal report was ever filed, and when questioned later, the sheriff stated the documents were too damaged to be legible and had been discarded as historically insignificant. According to a 1,965 statement made to a reporter for the Springfield newspaper, he saw lists of names next to them, with amounts ranging from $50 to $500, and what seemed like directions on how to mix concrete with other materials to speed up the process and reduce discovery. Shortly after talking to the reporter, the employee was fired, and the story was never published. After getting a call from a high-ranking state official, Thomas Lane, the reporter, subsequently told his colleagues that his editor had withdrawn the piece. Lane was unsuccessful in interviewing important witnesses when he tried to follow the story on his own. Suddenly, former local government contacts were no longer available. His request to review county records was turned down without providing a reason. After 3 months, Lane was moved to the agricultural beat, where he covered livestock auctions and crop yields instead of investigative articles. Dawson's private journal, which was also discovered in the satchel, was possibly the most unsettling. The water damage had rendered many pages illegible, but fragments remained intact, including an entry from October 5, 1904. Miller lasted nearly 30 hours. Could hear him through the wall until early this morning. Harlow says next time we should position them differently to avoid the sound carrying. The men are complaining about working conditions. Doubled their pay today and provided whiskey. Even so, 2 refused to continue and had to be threatened with legal consequences. This business is more difficult than Wilford suggested. Another partially legible entry read, Cooper knew what was happening when they brought him down. Fought like a wildcat, despite the laudanum. Took 4 men to hold him while the forms were positioned. Harlow wants to pour the remaining walls during night hours only. Says the screaming echoes too much during daytime. Can't risk being heard from the road. The final readable passage, dated October 12th, stated simply, It is finished. 23 problems permanently solved. Harlow has sealed the records in the north wall as instructed. God may judge us, but the town will thank us even if they never know exactly what was done on their behalf. The majority of people who witnessed the events directly were died by 1965. If it weren't for Jonathan Keyes, a PhD student studying Ozark construction methods, who brought the disparate fragments together to form a cohesive narrative, the story may have stayed completely hidden. Although his 1,967 thesis was accepted by the University of Missouri, it was never published. Researchers trying to access the manuscript in later years were told that it did not exist in their holdings, despite the fact that it was supposedly kept in the university library's special collections. For 2 years, Keyes had been collecting evidence, interviewing senior citizens, and looking for architectural irregularities in the few photos of the jail that had survived to be demolished. His efforts brought him in contact with a retired mason who had worked as an apprentice for the 1904 renovation contractor James Harlow. According to Keyes' notes, this unidentified source attested to the fact that inmates had been integrated into the building itself. Keyes wrote, "The old man told me they built forms around the men. in his study journal. They were drugged but still living when the concrete was poured. Harlow had calculated the exact wall thickness needed to contain a human body while maintaining structural integrity. The quicklime served dual purposes. It accelerated the setting of the concrete while also hastening decomposition and controlling odors. The victims were positioned in ways that would distribute their weight evenly throughout the structure. It was an act of engineering as much as it was murder. The mason explained the procedure in clinical detail. Inmates were placed within wooden forms after being anesthetized with laudanum. Their arms were frequently extended upward to save room, and their limbs were arranged to produce a consistent density within the wall. They were shoulder deep in the first pour. The entombment was finished with a second pour once this layer had partially set. Air ducts were occasionally added to speed up disintegration through microbial activity, which needs oxygen rather than because of humanitarian concerns. What haunts me most, Keyes wrote following the interview, is the casual manner in which the old man described these procedures. He spoke as if discussing the proper technique for installing windows or laying a foundation. The technical challenges had apparently occupied his attention more than the moral implications. He complained about the messy and inefficient aspects of the process, noting that Harlow had improved the technique with each successive wall. In 1968, while doing follow-up research in West Plains, Keyes himself vanished. His research materials were gone when his abandoned car was found close to the old jail location. According to the official investigation, he most likely departed the area voluntarily, citing recent relationship breakups and unpaid student loans as possible reasons. These theories, according to his relatives, were incompatible with his circumstances and character. Following the disappearance, Keyes's academic mentor, Professor Alan Thornhill, made an effort to track down his student's study. In an October 1968 letter to the university administration, Thornhill wrote that he was worried about the dot observed. "I have been unable to retrieve Jonathan's thesis from the department archives." Despite having personally submitted it there just months ago, the librarian insists no such document was ever processed. His research notes, which filled 2 large filing cabinets in our shared office, have similarly vanished. Most disturbing are the responses from individuals in West Plains who previously provided information to Jonathan. They now deny ever having spoken with him or claim their statements were misunderstood. This goes beyond normal academic disagreement into something that feels deliberately orchestrated. University officials dismissed Thornhill's worries as unsubstantiated speculation. His research funding was cut, and his tenure evaluation was unexpectedly delayed shortly after. Eventually, he gave up on his questions about Keyes's work and turned his attention to less contentious facets of architectural history. "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed without crushing whatever stands in the threshold," he said in a 1970 private letter to a colleague. "I fear Jonathan may have been such a casualty." Just before she passed away in 1969, historian Margaret Evers sent a private letter that contains the final recorded mention of the Howell County Jail event. "They've created a wall of silence as impenetrable as those that entombed those poor souls," she said in a letter to a colleague at the Smithsonian Institution, expressing her displeasure with ongoing barriers to her research. Local records disappear. Witnesses recant their testimonies, and colleagues suddenly lose interest in a story that should horrify any human conscience. "I've come to believe that the descendants of those responsible remain determined to keep this buried. Perhaps that's fitting. We are all still imprisoned by what happened in that place." Evers' letter continued, "What troubles me most is not just the act itself, horrific as it was, but the community's complicity in its concealment. Generation after generation has maintained this silence. Children and grandchildren of the perpetrators now sit on the very boards and commissions that control access to the evidence. The jail may be gone, but its shadow still darkens every aspect of life in West Plains. How many other such secrets lie buried in small towns across America, protected by time and the instinct for self-preservation?" Her final paragraph contained a warning. "If you choose to pursue this matter after my death, and I hope someone will proceed with extreme caution. 3 researchers before me have met with unfortunate accidents or sudden changes in career trajectory. My own home has been entered twice in the past month, though nothing of value was taken. Only my notes on the jail were disturbed. I've taken precautions with the most damning evidence, arranging for it to be held by a trusted friend who will know when and how to release it. Perhaps someday, when those with family connections to these events no longer wield power in Howell County, the full story can finally be told. No such evidence has ever surfaced. When the Missouri Historical Society received Evers' personal documents, there were notable gaps in the chronology. There was nothing at all of her research on the Howell County Jail, which, according to her correspondence, occupied 3 notebooks and a photo album. Her nephew, who had recently been appointed to a judgeship in Howell County, was the executive of the estate, and the accompanying inventory simply said that certain materials deemed of questionable historical validity have been excluded from the collection by the executive of the estate. The foundation stones from the dismantled jail were used all throughout the county. The retaining wall behind the new courthouse was constructed using some of these. Others joined the garden path of the First Methodist Church. Others were incorporated into West Plains' individual residences and commercial establishments. People who bought them at a county auction in 1952 said they had no idea where they came from. Those stones weren't right. A retired stonecutter called Walter Grimes testified to a local history buff in 1963 about these materials. When we cut them, they'd sometimes reveal these strange inclusions, dark streaks, or cavities filled with what looked like ash. Had a smell to them too, especially when wet. Most peculiar thing I ever worked with in 50 years of cutting stone. We were told to discard any pieces with those features. But there were so many that eventually we just turned them face down or inside out in whatever we were building. Grimes went on. One block we split revealed something unmistakable, a section of what appeared to be a human finger bone embedded in the limestone. The foreman took that piece and told us to forget we'd seen it, ordered us to stop splitting blocks altogether after that and only use them whole. Made the work harder, but nobody complained. We'd all seen enough to understand why certain precautions were being taken. Unusual issues were noted by a few of homeowners who had inadvertently utilized jail stones in their fireplaces. Between 1953 and 1957, there were 7 different requests to inspect chimneys in the West Plains area, according to county maintenance records. All of these requests described the same phenomenon: smoke that left an oily residue in contrast to typical wood smoke and had an odd, slightly sweet scent. The fireplaces in each instance had been built with materials taken from the jail's destruction. Eventually, they were all replaced and sealed. Abigail Winters, a homeowner, wrote about her experience to an acquaintance in 1955. The smell was unlike anything I can describe. Not quite rotting meat, not quite burning hair, but somehow reminiscent of both. It filled the house within minutes of lighting the fire and lingered for days afterward. The children complained of nightmares while it persisted. Thomas finally removed the entire chimney after our minister visited and refused to return to the house until it was gone. The mason who did the work found something troubling in the stones. He wouldn't specify what, but he refused payment and seemed eager to leave our property once the job was complete. The events of 1904 reverberate in those sleepy Ozark towns like a half-remembered nightmare. In local affairs, the families who profited from the removal of those 23 men continue to hold sway. The jail's former location is still underdeveloped. Visitors sometimes comment on the odd quiet amid the now tall and imposing oak tree forest, describing a sense of anticipatory quietness, as though the ground itself is holding its breath. Generation after generation of locals have opposed the site's development. Despite strong support from locals who were not aware of the land's past, a plan to construct a community center on the property was unanimously rejected by the County Commission in 1972. Despite the lack of a geological assessment, Commissioner Harold Wilford, Thomas Wilford's grandson, stated that unsuitable soil conditions was the main reason for rejection. The results of similar initiatives in 1986, 1994, and 2003 were the same. Various arguments were made, including zoning issues, historical preservation concerns, and environmental concerns. In each instance, descendants of the same families involved in the initial 1904 events participated in the decision-making process. Although the site's actual history was never mentioned in any of the official talks, lifelong locals observed that those in the know seemed particularly determined to keep the land undisturbed. We may never know the whole truth about what transpired over those fall weeks. Archives continue to lose their records. Digital versions of 1,904 newspaper accounts reveal unanticipated corruption in certain time periods. Excessive interest in the topic causes researchers to report unusual challenges in finding pertinent materials. A folklorist compiling Ozark stories in 1957 documented a story from an elderly Howell County resident that subtly alluded to the jail. "Folks around here don't build with old limestone," the guy stated. The folklorist observed that the man refused to go into further detail, growing agitated and insisting that some stories weren't meant to be preserved. "Some things you let die with the last person who remembers them," he reportedly said. "Not since the trouble at the county jail. They say those walls absorb the suffering of the men they put inside them. Stone has memory, you know. It holds on to things. You put a man's misery into your building materials. You're asking for that misery to seep into your home, little by little, year by year. Some memories are like poison. You don't bottle them up for future generations to swallow." Other indirect allusions to the jail might be found in the oral culture of the area. Some older residents refer to particularly vindictive actions as jail justice, but when asked where the term came from, they usually claim ignorance or shift the topic. Parents have been known to warn misbehaving children that the old jail walls still have room for one more. When a high school history teacher tried to incorporate the history of the jail into her local history curriculum, in 1998, she encountered unanticipated opposition from the school administration. Her contract was not renewed for the next year when she pursued the issue, citing academic freedom. The planned lesson plan, which presented the events as unverified historical rumors, was rejected as potentially disruptive to community relations. The fate of Dr. Thornton's core samples from 1961 may be the most instructive. The initial investigation verified that the sample contained human bone pieces and tissue remnants, as per laboratory documents acquired from a former employee in 1966. Those purporting to be from the Missouri State Historical Preservation Office, which according to state records did not exist at the time, seized the whole report and the physical samples. There were fragments of bone, certainly human, showing cut marks consistent with those made by masonry tools. The technician who conducted the initial tests told a Springfield attorney in a sworn statement about what he had discovered embedded in the wall material. More disturbing were the small pieces of preserved tissue that showed evidence of having been in contact with setting concrete while still alive. The cellular response indicated that these weren't remains placed in the walls after death. These were tissues from individuals who were alive when the material hardened around them. The technician was moved to another laboratory shortly after making this statement. In later years, when researchers reached out to him, he denied ever working on Howell County samples and implied that any statement he signed must have been a fake. Vernon Hayes, the lawyer who had taken the technician's statement, was still looking into the situation in private. Even while the Howell County episode was exceptionally heinous, it may not have been the only one because his archives, which were reviewed after his death in 1978, included correspondence with other scholars of a similar nature throughout the Ozarks. Hayes had recorded reports of similar incidents in 3 other counties in the same period, all involving the mysterious disappearance of unwanted people during building or remodeling. All of this was taking place under the control of representatives of the same political and commercial forces that had previously operated in West Plains. Although his notes show that Hayes never published his findings, he had planned to gather them into a book that he had provisionally titled Buried Justice: Institutional Murder in the Ozarks. However, the work was never finished. He had met with a representative of a publishing business to discuss the project 2 weeks prior to his death, which was ascribed to a hunting accident. A storage box in the Howell County Courthouse basement archives that holds records from 1900 to 1905 is noticeably empty, save for one index card. Simply written in faded writing, It says, materials temporarily removed for preservation purposes, 1,962. Almost 60 years later, the materials have never been put back. The men who came for the records showed credentials I did not recognize, wrote Harriet Winters, the archivist who handled this removal, in her personal journal, which was found among her belongings after her death in 1966. When I questioned the unusual nature of removing entire years of county records, they explained it was part of a statewide preservation initiative. All materials would be microfilmed and returned within 6 months. I asked for written authorization and was given a form with the county executive's signature, though it appeared hastily done. Something about their manner disturbed me deeply. I made private notations of exactly what was removed, including Sheriff Dawson's logbooks and Judge Crawford's sentencing records. I've placed this inventory in my safe deposit box as a precaution. No such inventory has ever been found. When Winters's safe deposit box was opened after her passing, it only had a few pieces of ancestral jewelry and family records. According to the bank manager, Winters had opened the box just 2 days prior to her passing, which raises the possibility that she took out private documents when she became aware of her deteriorating condition. In 1969, Harold Winters, an elderly mason who had worked as an apprentice for James Harlow, broke decades of quiet by leaving a handwritten confession with his lawyer. The document, which was made public after his death, read simply, "The walls were 2 feet thick when finished. The men were placed inside forms, still alive, and the concrete poured around them. Quicklime was added to accelerate decomposition and minimize odor. Some took hours to die, others days. We were told they were all violent criminals destined for hanging anyway. I have since learned this was untrue. I have carried this knowledge like stones in my pockets, pulling me beneath dark water. May God forgive what we did in that place." He explained how Harlow had altered conventional masonry methods to make room for human beings without compromising the structure's structural soundness. Forms based on drugged but aware men were used to build the walls in parts. After pouring concrete to their shoulders and letting it partially set, the finished product was placed over their heads. Both the bodies inside the concrete and the setting concrete were penetrated by vertical support rods. "The worst part," wrote Winters, "was that Harlow seemed proud of the technical challenge. He spoke of it as an engineering problem to be solved, calculating load-bearing requirements and material densities, as if he weren't discussing the entombment of living men. He made drawings and measurements that he later burned. He took notes on how long it took different subjects to stop moving inside the setting concrete. God help me. I watched and said nothing." Shortly after being reviewed by a Street Louis journalist who had shown interest in the topic, the confession vanished from the lawyer's files. The following week, the lawyer himself had a stroke that rendered him incapable of speaking. Although there are multiple exact quotes in the journalist's notes that support previous study findings, no copy of the document has ever been found again. In 1970, the writer Rebecca Lawson tried to write a piece based on Winters' admission. Despite her well-established reputation as a meticulous investigator, the article was rejected by 3 newspapers and 2 magazines. An editor with whom she had previously had a fruitful working relationship wrote the final rejection letter, explaining that although the story was compelling, it lacked sufficient documentary evidence to justify the serious allegations against prominent Missouri families. The editor also suggested that publishing such material could expose the paper to significant legal liability. Lawson kept up his independent research, concentrating on the financial ties between the families involved in the Howell County tragedy and different state agencies. In 1971, her flat was broken into, and her study papers were taken. According to the police report, her files, typewriter, and camera were gone, but valuables like her jewelry and television had remained intact. There were never any suspects named. The Howell County Jail is a testament to the most sinister aspects of human intelligence. Its non-existent halls are not haunted by ghosts. The hands that mixed quicklime and concrete were not guided by any supernatural force. The community's acceptance of the ensuing stillness and the icy consideration with which common men turned a place of temporary incarceration into a permanent grave are the only things that can be considered horrifying. The story has sometimes reappeared in scholarly circles in the years since it was demolished, only to be written off as a conspiracy theory or local legend. Expert historians point to the inconsistent witness accounts, the dearth of definitive documented proof, and the impossibility of such an event happening in the absence of widespread public awareness. The evidence gaps themselves, however, exhibit a pattern of purposeful removal rather than natural absence, according to those who have examined the case the most. What's left is a puzzle with pieces missing, a story pieced together from murmurs, shards, and the strange silences that accompany some inquiries. The decades-long pattern of resistance points to a concerted attempt to censor knowledge, rather than the aging process of historical memory. Records that ought to be there don't. Witnesses either deny or alter their accounts. Unexpected obstacles are encountered by researchers. The unmarked graves of 23 forgotten men are still covered by oak trees. Their roots extend toward non-existent foundations through layers of imported soil. And something is still hidden behind walls made of recycled limestone in West Plains' oldest residences. Not just bones, but the understanding of what occurs when convenience takes the place of justice, when human lives are weighed against wealth and are determined to be lacking. In 2015, a real estate developer suggested constructing a modest shopping center on the location of the former jail. Residents in the village voiced unusually strong resistance to the project, citing worries about historic preservation and the ecology. The site's darker past was not discussed, but the development idea was eventually shelved. Despite the grove's ideal location close to the town center, the site appears doomed to remain undeveloped. The official justification mentioned soil instability concerns, yet the public hearings never saw the presentation of an engineering assessment. A visiting journalist observed a connection between some of the speakers at these gatherings and the families who had participated in the initial activities, although local coverage of the events did not mention it. The place is sometimes visited on dare by local high school students, especially around Halloween. There is an unearthly quiet among the oaks, according to some, a calm that seems to absorb sound instead of simply not having it. Others talk about feeling like they're being watched or followed. These are written off as the imagination of adolescence, yet new pupils come back year after year with similar stories. In 2010, 30 students visited the location without knowing its history as part of an unofficial experiment led by a psychology professor at the University of Missouri. Walking through the grove caused unusual discomfort, according to 60% of respondents. The professor pointed out that when asked to describe the situation, many people used words like oppressive, watched, or trapped. These responses were much more common than those found at control sites with similar physical qualities but different histories. Howell County's limestone walls have long since been scattered, buried, or reduced to rubble. However, evidence of these occurrences still exists somewhere in the Ozarks, possibly in a forgotten family attic or the basement of a courthouse, waiting to shatter the meticulously erected barriers of silence and time like the truth itself. In the Ozarks, the next time you see an old stone wall, you might stop and think about where it came from, press your hand against the chilly limestone, and listen. Something may be preserved in the voids between the calcium carbonate molecules that were created from ancient seabeds on the stone's porous surface. The imprint of last moments, preserved by individuals who thought certain secrets could be buried forever, rather than memory as we know it. They were mistaken. Piece by piece, generation by generation, the history of the Howell County Jail is revealed in bits and pieces. Every researcher contributes a new piece to the mosaic. With every witness that speaks up, another dark area is illuminated. In addition to what transpired behind those walls in 1904, the evidence also points to the decades-long conspiracy that involved hundreds of people, the majority of whom only had partial knowledge of what they were defending. Perhaps the real horror of West Plains lies not in the fact that 23 men were set in stone, but rather in the fact that a whole community chose to keep quiet about the crime rather than pursue justice. By doing this, They created a different kind of prison, one with cells constructed of inherited secrets rather than iron bars and walls composed of complicity rather than limestone. And more than a century later, the town itself is still imprisoned there, still carrying out its sentence. Dorothy Wilford, the great-granddaughter of Commissioner Thomas Wilford, reached out to a University of Missouri historian in 2018. She had made the decision to release records that had been passed down through the generations, materials that her ancestors had kept safe despite their damning nature after decades of family quiet. Perhaps as one gets closer to death, feelings of guilt or a yearning for forgiveness intensify. Maybe secrets become too burdensome to bear after death. Regardless of her reasons, among the documents she submitted was Thomas Wilford's private journal, which detailed meetings with Judge Crawford, Sheriff Dawson, and Mason James Harlow to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of their suggested course of action. The journal contained specific information about the planning and implementation of what he called the permanent solution. They talked about potential issues, technical difficulties, and ways to maintain confidentiality. Most troublingly, they gathered comprehensive data on every prisoner, evaluating their desirability and the possibility of ongoing questions about their whereabouts. A chilling cost analysis was included in Wilford's journal, which contrasted the cost of keeping inmates for their entire sentences with the one-time cost of incorporation into the structure. He also mentioned the added advantage of deterring potential troublemakers, though this benefit would have to be left unsaid because the official narrative would describe a regular transfer of inmates to other facilities. According to the documents, the plot involved not only the jail officials, but also the town doctor, newspaper editor, telegraph operator, and a number of well-known merchants. This network of cooperation made sure that no investigation would go too far and that no witness would talk too candidly. They all had something to gain, whether it was money, political power, or just getting rid of people who had threatened their standing or interests. Dorothy Wilford overdosed on sleeping pills and committed suicide 3 weeks after turning over the records. It said simply, "Some burdens cannot be passed to another generation. May God forgive what my family has done." The records she gave were verified by several specialists and are currently at the Missouri State Archives, where researchers can access them. The last parts of this sinister puzzle have now come to light after decades of hiding. It is no longer possible to write off the happenings at the Howell County Jail as a myth or fable. The only thing left to do is to remember the 23 men who vanished inside those walls, not as anonymous victims, but as people whose lives were considered expendable by those in positions of authority. Jacob Miller, Thomas Cooper, Franklin Ellis, William Parker, Joseph Donovan, Charles Thompson, Henry Washington, Samuel Green, David Martinez, Michael Ayor, Patrick Callahan, Robert Johnson, James Williams, John Smith, Daniel Brown, Edward Davis, George Wilson, Harold Thompson, Richard Lee, Benjamin Adams, Frederick Jackson, Thomas Murphy, and Peter Kovatz are now known by their actual names. The majority of them had in fact committed the small infractions for which they were condemned, so they were far from perfect. However, none of them deserved the destiny they were given. Being drugged, wrapped in concrete while still alive, and abandoned to perish in the dark. Their last hours filled with fear and the slow understanding that there would be no help, no pity. The reality of what transpired at the Howell County Jail serves as a cautionary tale about the possibility of brutality in any society. The pernicious nature of collective silence and the ease with which human life can be devalued when it becomes inconvenient for those in positions of power. The most heinous crimes are rarely carried out by lone lunatics, but rather by regular people who persuade themselves that their actions are for the greater good, or who just don't challenge the judgments of those they defer to and admire. The concealment that shielded the guilty for over a century has eventually fallen apart like mortar left out to the weather, but the oak grove and pieces of limestone still make up portions of walls all around West Plains. History must now make room for the truth that has come out of its tomb.